Welcome, dear viewers, to a tale as old as the Nigerian hills themselves. Gather around, for today we are going to unravel the mystery of why tortoises have cracked shells. This is no ordinary story, my friends. It's a tale of cunning, greed, and the sky-high price of trickery. So, settle in, and let's journey to a time when animals spoke, and a certain tortoise thought he was cleverer than them all. Picture, if you will, a lush Nigerian forest. The air is thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming flowers. Sunlight dapples the forest floor through a canopy of leaves, creating a magical dance of light and shadow. In this enchanted place lived all manner of creatures, from the tiniest ant to the mightiest elephant. But among them all, one stood out not for his size or strength, but for his wit. This was Tortoise, known far and wide for his clever tongue and quick mind. Now, Tortoise wasn't much to look at. His shell was smooth and unremarkable, his legs short and stubby. But oh, the plans he could hatch. The schemes he could weave. Tortoise was forever dreaming up ways to get ahead, to outsmart his fellow animals, to get the better end of any deal. One sweltering afternoon, as Tortoise was lounging in a patch of sunlight, his ears pricked up at the sound of excited chatter. Two brightly colored parrots had alighted on a nearby branch, their feathers gleaming like jewels in the sun. "Oh, sister," said one parrot to the other, "can you believe the news? The Sky King is throwing a grand feast." The other parrot fluffed her feathers in delight. "I know. They say every bird in the world is invited. Just imagine, delicacies from every corner of the earth, all laid out on tables made of clouds." Tortoise's eyes widened. A feast. In the sky. With food from all over the world. His mouth began to water at the very thought. But then reality came crashing down like a fallen branch. He was Tortoise, bound to the earth. How could he ever attend a feast meant for those who ruled the skies? But remember, dear viewers, this was no ordinary tortoise. As he watched the parrots preen and chatter, the gears in his clever mind began to turn. A plan started to form, as intricate and delicate as a spider's web. Putting on his most charming smile, Tortoise called out to the parrots. "My colorful friends, what wonderful news you bring. A feast in the sky, how marvelous." The parrots turned to him, surprise evident in their bright eyes. "Why, Tortoise," they said, "surely you understand this feast is only for those who can fly." Tortoise's smile didn't falter for a moment. Of course," he said smoothly. "But you know, I've been thinking. Wouldn't it be splendid if I could attend? I'm known far and wide for my storytelling skills. Think of how I could entertain the guests with my tales." The parrots exchanged skeptical glances. Tortoise pressed on, his voice as sweet as honey. "Just imagine, you'd be the talk of the feast. The clever birds who brought such marvelous entertainment. Why, the Sky King himself would surely be impressed by your ingenuity." The parrots huddled together, whispering furiously. Tortoise waited, trying to look nonchalant while his heart raced with anticipation. Finally, they turned back to him. "Your idea has merit, Tortoise," they admitted. "But how do you propose to reach the sky? You have no wings." Oh, this was the moment Tortoise had been waiting for. His eyes gleamed with triumph as he unveiled the next part of his plan. "My friends," he said, "that's where I need your help. If each bird could spare just one feather, we could fashion a pair of wings for me. I'd be able to soar alongside you to the feast. And once we arrive, I'd return each feather to its rightful owner. What do you say?" The parrots were quiet for a moment, considering. Then, slowly, they nodded. "Very well, Tortoise, they said. We'll spread the word. But remember, you've made a promise to return the feathers. Word of Tortoise's plan spread through the forest like wildfire. Birds of every kind, from tiny hummingbirds to majestic eagles, came to offer their feathers. Some were skeptical, others amused, but all were curious to see if Tortoise could pull off this incredible feat. As the days passed, Tortoise's makeshift wings grew more and more impressive. Blues, reds, greens, and golds, every color imaginable was represented in his magnificent new plumage. Tortoise practiced flying, stumbling and falling at first, but gradually gaining confidence. The night before the great feast, Tortoise could hardly sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind filled with visions of the delicacies that awaited him in the sky. But as excited as he was about the food, a small part of him was even more thrilled at the thought of having outsmarted all the birds. As dawn broke on the day of the feast, Tortoise gathered with the birds, ready for their journey to the sky. But before they took off, he had one last request. "My dear friends," Tortoise said, his voice dripping with false modesty, "I've been thinking. Where I come from, it's customary to take a new name for grand occasions. I've chosen a special name for this feast, and I'd be ever so grateful if you could all remember it." The birds, intrigued, asked what name he had chosen. Tortoise smiled his craftiest smile. "For this feast," he announced, "I shall be known as all of you." The birds found this strange, but in their excitement for the upcoming feast, they didn't give it much thought. They agreed to remember his new name, and with a great fluttering of wings, the entire flock took to the sky. And there, in their midst, soared Tortoise, his borrowed feathers gleaming in the morning sun. As they climbed higher and higher, Tortoise's heart raced with excitement. The ground below grew smaller and smaller until the great forest looked like nothing more than a patch of moss. Clouds drifted by, close enough to touch, and Tortoise marveled at their softness. The other birds chattered excitedly, pointing out landmarks far below and speculating about the feast to come. But Tortoise remained uncharacteristically quiet, focused entirely on the promise of the sumptuous meal that awaited him. As they neared their destination, a magnificent sight came into view. There, perched atop the highest clouds, was a palace that shimmered like a mirage. Its towers spiraled up into the endless blue, and its gates were crafted from the purest gold. This, Tortoise realized with a thrill, must be the home of the Sky King. As the flock approached, the golden gates swung open silently. They flew into a courtyard so vast it seemed to stretch to the horizons. Here, clouds had been shaped into tables and chairs, upon which rested the most tantalizing array of foods Tortoise had ever seen. There were fruits of every color, glistening with morning dew. Roasted meats sent up tantalizing aromas that made Tortoise's mouth water. Sweetmeats and pastries were piled high on golden platters, and crystal glasses filled with nectar caught the sunlight, sparkling like liquid rainbows. In the center of it all stood the Sky King himself, resplendent in robes that seemed to be woven from the very sky. His crown was adorned with stars that twinkled even in the bright daylight. As the birds settled onto the cloud tables, a hush fell over the gathering. The Sky King raised his hands in welcome, his voice booming across the heavenly expanse. "Welcome, welcome all," he cried. "This magnificent feast is for all of you." And it was at that moment, dear viewers, that Tortoise's clever plan reached its climax. Quick as lightning, Tortoise stepped forward, his borrowed feathers gleaming in the celestial light. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said, bowing low. "That is indeed my name, all of you. So this magnificent feast must be for me alone." A gasp rippled through the gathered birds. They looked at each other in confusion, then at Tortoise, who was already making his way to the nearest table. The Sky King, caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events, could only watch in bewilderment as Tortoise began to eat. And oh, how Tortoise ate! He sampled delicacies from every corner of the earth. Succulent fruits from tropical islands, exotic spices from distant lands, tender meats prepared in ways he'd never imagined. Each bite was a new adventure, each morsel a taste of paradise. The birds, meanwhile, could only watch in growing hunger and disbelief. They had flown so far, their wings aching from the journey, only to be denied the very feast they'd been promised. Some of the smaller birds began to chirp in distress, their tiny stomachs growling audibly. As Tortoise continued his gluttonous rampage, the birds began to huddle together in small groups. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to outright discussions. "Did you hear what he called himself?" a sparrow asked her neighbor. "All of you," replied a wise old owl, shaking his head. "He tricked us, plain and simple." "But why did we agree to such a strange name?" wondered a colorful macaw. "Because we were too excited about the feast to think clearly," answered a practical pigeon. "Tortoise has always been cunning, but this time he's gone too far." As the realization of Tortoise's trickery spread, the mood among the birds shifted from confusion to anger. They had been kind enough to lend him their feathers, to bring him to this heavenly feast, and this was how he repaid them. The Sky King, who had been watching these proceedings with growing concern, finally stepped forward. His brow was furrowed, and the stars on his crown seemed to flicker with barely contained energy. "Tortoise," he boomed, his voice like rolling thunder, "is this true? Have you deceived these good birds who brought you here?" Tortoise, his mouth full of celestial delicacies, looked up with feigned innocence. "Your Majesty," he said after swallowing hard, "I merely accepted the generous invitation you extended to all of you. Is it my fault that happens to be my name for today?" The Sky King's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being outsmarted, especially not in his own realm. "And what of these birds?" he asked, gesturing to the hungry flock. "Were they not also invited to partake in this feast?" Tortoise, realizing he was on shaky ground, began to backpedal. Of course," he said hastily. "I was merely sampling the dishes first, to ensure everything was to your Majesty's high standards." But the birds had heard enough. Led by the wise old owl, they began to approach Tortoise, their eyes glinting with a mixture of hunger and retribution. "Tortoise," said the owl, his voice calm but firm, "you have broken your promise. You said you would entertain us with stories, but instead, you've eaten our feast. You said you would return our feathers, but you've made no move to do so." Tortoise, sensing the change in atmosphere, began to edge away from the table. His belly was full to bursting, and he was finding it difficult to move quickly. Now, he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "let's not be hasty. Surely we can come to some arrangement." But the birds were done listening to Tortoise's mood talk. One by one, they began to pluck their feathers from his makeshift wings. Tortoise, realizing the gravity of his situation, began to panic. Without those feathers, how would he get back to Earth? He looked around wildly, searching for an escape route, but everywhere he turned, he saw only angry birds and the endless expanse of sky. As the last feather was reclaimed, Tortoise found himself balanced precariously on the edge of a cloud. The smooth shell that had once been his pride now felt like a terrible burden, threatening to pull him down into the endless blue below. "Please," he begged, his earlier bravado completely gone, "you can't leave me here. How will I get home?" The birds looked at each other, conflicted. Despite Tortoise's trickery, many of them were kind-hearted and didn't wish him real harm. But before they could decide what to do, a strong gust of wind swept through the Sky King's palace. "Tortoise," without his borrowed feathers to stabilize him, felt himself tipping backwards. Time seemed to slow as he teetered on the edge of the cloud. He saw the shocked faces of the birds, the stunned visage of the Sky King, the tantalizing remains of the feast he had so greedily devoured. And then, he was falling. Down, down, down through the sky, picking up speed as he went. The wind rushed past him, drowning out his terrified cries. The ground, which had seemed so far away during the flight up, now rushed towards him at a terrifying pace. As he fell, Tortoise's mind raced. How could he save himself? What could he do to survive this fall? And if he did survive, how would he ever face the animals of the forest again? As Tortoise plummeted through the sky, his mind raced faster than his falling body. The smooth shell that had once been his pride now seemed like a death sentence, its weight pulling him down faster and faster. The wind howled in his ears, drowning out his own terrified thoughts. But even in this moment of sheer panic, Tortoise's cunning nature didn't desert him. As the ground grew ever closer, an idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. With all the strength he could muster, Tortoise called out to the creatures of the earth below. "Hello down there," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the rushing wind. "I bring a message from the Sky King. He requests that you prepare a soft landing for his special envoy." Far below, the animals of the forest heard Tortoise's faint cries. They looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a small shape hurtling towards them at an alarming speed. Word spread quickly through the forest. A messenger from the Sky King. This was unprecedented. The animals scurried about in a frenzy, unsure of what to do but eager to please the mighty ruler of the skies. "Quick!" shouted a deer. "Let's gather the softest leaves and grass we can find." "And moss," added a rabbit. "Lots of moss." The forest floor became a hive of activity. Squirrels darted up trees, bringing down armfuls of the softest leaves. Elephants used their trunks to uproot whole bushes of fragrant grass. Monkeys swarmed from branch to branch, stripping trees of their mossy coverings. As they walked, however, doubt began to creep in. An old leopard, wise in the ways of the forest, narrowed his eyes at the approaching shape. "Wait a moment," he growled. "Doesn't that look suspiciously like our friend Tortoise?" The animals paused in their frantic preparations, looking up with new scrutiny. Indeed, as the falling shape drew closer, it became unmistakably clear that it was none other than Tortoise, his shell glinting in the sunlight. "But how?" asked a confused antelope. "And why?" As if in answer, a flock of birds appeared on the horizon, diving down from the sky in hot pursuit of the falling tortoise. As they drew near, they began to call out warnings. "Don't be fooled," they cried. "Tortoise has tricked us all. He's no messenger of the Sky King." Quickly, the birds explained Tortoise's deception at the heavenly feast. The forest animals listened in growing anger and disbelief. How dare Tortoise try to trick them again, after all his past misdeeds? The mood on the forest floor shifted dramatically. Where moments before there had been a frenzy to create a soft landing, now there was a determination to teach Tortoise a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. "Quick!" shouted the old leopard. "Clear away all the soft things. Let him land on the hard earth he's so fond of tricking." With the same energy they'd used to gather soft materials, the animals now walked to clear the landing area. Leaves were swept away, grass was trampled down, and the ground was left bare and unyielding. Tortoise, still falling, saw the activity below with growing alarm. His plan was unraveling before his eyes, and the hard ground was rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. In his last moment of descent, Tortoise closed his eyes tight and withdrew into his shell as much as he could. He braced for impact, his mind flashing through all the tricks and schemes that had led him to this moment. With a resounding crack, Tortoise struck the ground. The impact sent shockwaves through the forest, causing birds to take flight from nearby trees and small animals to dive for cover. For a moment, everything was still. The forest animals gathered around, holding their breath, wondering if Tortoise had survived his terrifying fall. Slowly, ever so slowly, Tortoise's head emerged from his shell. He blinked, dazed but very much alive. However, as he tried to move, he realized something was terribly wrong. His once smooth shell now felt different, rough, uneven, and yes, cracked. As Tortoise stumbled to his feet, he caught his reflection in a nearby pond. His shell, once his pride and joy, was now a patchwork of cracks and fissures. It looked as though it had been broken into 100 pieces and hastily glued back together. The animals of the forest gathered around, their anger giving way to a mix of pity and schadenfreude. The birds who had followed him down from the sky feast landed nearby, still ruffled and indignant. "Well, Tortoise," said the wise old owl, "it seems your trickery has finally caught up with you." Tortoise, for once, was at a loss for words. He ran a trembling hand over his cracked shell, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. But even as he stood there, surrounded by the animals he had tried to deceive, the gears in Tortoise's mind began to turn once more. Perhaps, he thought, there was a way to turn even this disaster to his advantage. After all, he was still the cleverest animal in the forest, cracked shell or not. As the animals debated what to do with him, Tortoise's eyes gleamed with the spark of a new idea. He may have fallen from the sky, but he wasn't down for the count just yet. As the animals debated what to do with him, Tortoise cleared his throat. "My friends," he began, his voice weak but still smooth as honey, "I know I've made a terrible mistake. But look at what my folly has cost me." He gestured dramatically to his cracked shell. "This," he continued, "is a sign from the Sky King himself. He has marked me as a reminder to all of the dangers of greed and trickery. From this day forward, I shall be a living lesson, a humble teacher to all who see me." The animals exchanged skeptical glances. Could they trust Tortoise's words? The wise old owl hooted softly. "Tortoise, your words are as clever as always. But how can we be sure you've truly learned your lesson?" Tortoise bowed his head in apparent shame. "I understand your doubts. I propose this: let me travel the forest, sharing the tale of my misdeeds and the consequences I faced. My cracked shell will be proof of my story, and perhaps others can learn from my mistakes." The animals huddled together, whispering and debating. Finally, the old leopard stepped forward. "Very well, Tortoise. We will allow you this chance to make amends. But know this, we will be watching. If you return to your tricks, you'll find no mercy next time." And so, Tortoise set out on a journey through the forest. At each clearing and waterhole, he recounted the tale of his grand deception and spectacular fall. Animals gathered to hear his story, marveling at his cracked shell and the lesson it represented. To everyone's surprise, including perhaps his own, Tortoise found he enjoyed his new role. The attention he received as a storyteller was, in its own way, as satisfying as his clever tricks had once been. And though he would never admit it, a small part of him began to understand the value of honesty and humility. As Tortoise's tale spread, a change came over the forest. Animals became more wary of deception, more appreciative of honesty. They learned to think twice before acting on greed or pride. The forest became a more harmonious place, with creatures looking out for one another instead of trying to get ahead at others' expense. And Tortoise, much to his own surprise, found a new kind of respect among the animals. They came to him not just for his entertaining stories, but for his hard-earned wisdom. His cracked shell, once a mark of shame, became a symbol of growth and redemption. As the seasons changed and the forest flourished, Tortoise's journey came full circle. He returned to the clearing where his great fall had occurred, now a wiser and more contented creature. The animals gathered to welcome him, no longer with suspicion, but with warmth and acceptance. And so, dear viewers, our tale of the tortoise and the birds comes to an end. But the lessons learned echo through the forest to this day, reminding us all of the importance of honesty, humility, and the capacity for change. From this timeless Nigerian folktale, we can draw 5 important moral lessons. 1. Greed often leads to downfall. Tortoise's excessive desire for the feast led to his dramatic fall from the sky. This reminds us that unchecked greed can have severe consequences. 2. Cleverness without kindness is dangerous. While Tortoise's wit was impressive, using it to deceive others ultimately caused him harm. True wisdom involves using our intelligence to help, not hurt. 3. Actions have consequences. Tortoise's trickery resulted in his cracked shell, a permanent reminder of his misdeeds. This teaches us that our actions, good or bad, can have lasting effects. 4. Redemption is possible. Despite his past mistakes, Tortoise found a way to make amends and become a positive influence. This shows that it's never too late to change and make things right. 5. Our challenges can become our strengths. Tortoise's cracked shell, initially a punishment, became a tool for teaching and connecting with others. This reminds us that our hardships can often be transformed into our greatest assets. As we close this chapter, dear viewers, let's carry these lessons with us. May we be wise like the owl, strong like the leopard, and ultimately, learn to grow from our mistakes like Tortoise. Until our next tale, remember, a cracked shell can lead to an open heart.